We're here with Quinn Hughes, writer of the We Got It series. This is a discussion on part 3, Riot in G Major. So Quinn, can you please start your piece, your discussion with us actually about how you started your piece with a quote from Fred Moten. Can you tell us about Moten and how you've connected with this particular scholar?
Sure. So Fred Moten is a poet and a philosopher. He teaches performance at New York University. He's also a finalist for the National Book Award for his poetry book called The Field Trio. And I got exposed to his work through doing debate, and a lot of folks reading the scholarship, spreading the scholarship through debate. But specifically what stood out to me with Fred Moten's work is his kind of ability to articulate black aesthetics so powerfully and black life that kind of escapes our ability, or whiteness's ability, to articulate or think about black life. Specifically with the quote about Michael Brown, Dr. Moten and his writing partner Stefano Harney write about kind of this other city, or this other possibility of a city that exists in like this kind of black collective space making and space creating and world and world making that kind of resists and is always entangled with black life, which is to say always entangled with black death. And so when we think about the images and the sounds that accompany blackness and the words that accompany blackness, we kind of are demanded to articulate through aesthetics, through music, through song, through dance, because these are all the languages that have been given to us that kind of resist the desire of whiteness to fully know, think through, apprehend, capture, touch, feel. And so what Moten's work was able to do is give me a language to think through and imagine and articulate everything that's always been present with me. So I wanted to start with that, not only to pay respect to where I've been, but also to kind of ground my own scholarship in a place that is able to kind of get to something that's very been present with my own lived experience to help guide my writing.
Thank you. So can you also then speak a little into your choices to reference Stevie Wonder's As and Alice Walker, particularly The Color Purple? Why are these artists important for you to mention within your piece?
Yeah, I think what immediately draws me to As, and As is one of my favorite songs, not only from, like, we could have a whole conversation about why As is just and Songs in Key of Life in general is a musical feat. Like, it's like one of the greatest compilations of just artistry in human history, and that's a separate conversation. I think what As specifically, the specific lyrics of As, Stevie Wonder says, like, I'll be loving you until you are me and I am you. You know, that one line has always stood out to me because it is something that has given us an ability to think about this kind of deconstruction of subjectivity. What does it mean to love until there is no distinction between the self, the other, until we are all kind of necessarily entangled with one? And I think what appeals to me about it in the context of this most recent work is that if you specifically are thinking about blackness in the belly of the slave ship, in the plantation, in the hold, in all the awkward positions in which we find black folks throughout black history, for me what's so important about As is that it kind of gets at this very specific feeling of entanglement when the luxury of a static subject, a static category of being, a static ontological position isn't allotted. And so what if instead of we thinking about this as like whiteness would make this as overdetermined as like a position of suffering, a position of violence, but what Stevie Wonder articulates is the magic that is present within this entanglement, the magic that is present within these places in these like kind of geographical ways in which blackness occupies space. And I think Alice Walker gets at this very raw feeling in the speech that she gives at this anti-nuclear weapons rally, when she says, you know, let the bombs cover the ground like rain, for nothing short of total destruction will ever teach the white man anything. I think what Walker gets at is that sometimes being in the world and being within this entanglement is extremely violent and extremely painful. So what if we imagine another space that cannot exist as long as this one does? And Alice Walker concludes that article by saying, life is better than death only because it has fresh peaches in it, which I think is a shocking way to end it. And I think the love and the bliss of a fresh peach, when paired with the way in which Stevie Wonder articulates being, entanglement, subjectivity, give us a way to think about blackness, relationality, experience, physical senses that is inaccessible to the language and the grammar that has been allotted through the world.
Thank you. Now, can you elaborate more on what you mean in this line? The freedom of the world relying on the earth-shattering force of the possibility of an I.
Yeah, of course. So I think like the Western Enlightenment kind of begins with Descartes' kind of classic phrase, "I think, therefore I am," which immediately becomes this kind of distinction from the thinking I to the non-thinking other, the chair, the table, the desk, the house, the rock. You know, I can call myself a static subject because I can objectify something that is distant from me. It is this I that then allows for, you know, the captive subject, the black, the erased subject of the indigenous folk, you know, the savage, etc. All these interrelationships that we're able to have from one another, the terrorist, the criminal, you know, are able to happen because we can create a fine, immediate distinction from the self of the other. Whiteness and its ability to permeate, destroy, obliterate the earth is able to exist because there is an immediate distinction of the self from the other. Which is to say that if we see every day that it is whiteness that ends the world, it is whiteness that is climate change, it is whiteness that is physically tearing the physical world apart. That whiteness is, you know, this demand of an I. Dr. Moten says in another work, to have an ontological position and to know it is what it would mean to be white. Whiteness is a demand for a positionality. Whiteness is a demand for being, a demand of an I, a demand of a static subject position, a demand for which necessarily is a demand for the other, a demand for the object, a demand for a static positionality external to oneself. And so, if we have any love for the moon, the stars, as Alice Walker says, we would do everything that we can do to keep the white man away from them, which is to say we would do everything we can do to destroy the possibility of an I, which is to say we destroy the possibility of an object, which is to say destroy the possibility of, you know, destroying the earth because we see that there's no boundary between the earth where we begin and where we end and the earth begins. You know, and hopefully that gives us a language or a possibility to think about violence differently, our relationships to one another differently.
You say white environmentalism is an impossibility. Where does this term come from, and can you explain this more for us, especially when considering the paradigm of world making and world breaking?
Yeah, I think this is very much tied up in, you know, this question of I-ness. We know white environmentalism is an impossibility because we know that the ability to preserve the earth is predicated on this destruction of the subject and the object. As long as there's a distinction between the subject and the object, the earth will be obliterated. There's no world within that that's possible. Again, you know, what is whiteness but a demand for the subject and the object? Which is to say that white environmentalism, or white people with the capacity to protect the environment, is an impossibility because it's essentially a conundrum or an oxymoron, because the ability to protect the world while demanding the world that's in the positionality of objecthood cannot coexist with one another, which is precisely why whiteness and like a peaceful world where there's, you know, no carbon emissions that are too high, no hole in the ozone layer, no phosphorus in the ocean, etc., is they're mutually exclusive, you know. So with the question of world making or world breaking, you know, it's something that, you know, gives us a fugitive line of freedom or a line of flight that escapes and breaks and creates new relationships and new epistemic grounds, new ways to create knowledge, new ways to think about being, new ways to create subjectivity that are parasitic to the world. When Stevie Wonder is articulating as you know, loving as entanglement, it is creating a line of fugitivity that escapes this world because this world is not able to articulate or understand or wrap its mind around blackness that refuses a subject and object distinction. So that's where I began my journey, especially in my grandparents' house. This is where I felt most centered in that. And that's what drew me to writing about that experience in this piece as well. You know, because when we're talking about creating a world, creating a new world, is that possibility of creating freedom, flight, fugitivity, new space, new world, that kind of gets at unmaking or untying the fabrics that weave this world together, which is to say objectivity, subjectivity, I-ness, me-ness, you-ness.
You mentioned your grandparents' house. Would you be willing to say a little bit more about why you included such a vivid and personal narrative aspect to this piece, which is a little different from what we've experienced in your previous pieces?
Yeah. There are a couple of reasons why I chose to write about my grandparents' house. I think, first and foremost, it was a very like magical place to spend summers growing up when I was really young in Detroit. And so it was like a place that a lot of the reasons why I think about what I think about or write about what I write about comes from either my time spent at their home and my time spent in Harlem at the Harlem School of the Arts. They really come from like those two, physical spaces. And so when I wanted to push myself to write something more personal, more immediate, and more material, that just became the naturalist, most familiar place to begin. And so then I think it just became like I also felt like spending time there last year when neither of them were there after having passed away, it felt like there needed to be some way to pay homage to them and pay homage to all that I had gained from them and continue to get from them. One, to pay respect. Two, to do myself the service of grounding my work in something that is material and physical to me. And I think like one of my frustrations with critical theory or whatever you call this type of writing is that it becomes very much grounded in something that is, it can quickly become grounded in something that is less material or less immediate. So writers that I really admire always find a way to incorporate some degree of lived experiences in their writing. And so as I feel like I wanted to challenge myself and challenge my work to progress and become more material, I felt like I also needed, for the sake of the reader, for the sake of being able to build something very material out of this genre of writing, there needs to be some way in which I can push myself to draw the connections between my own personal life and what I write about. Because once that becomes more distant, the question for me becomes, who am I really writing for? And I think if I start writing about black folks that I love about, care about, and who love me, care for me, I think it'll be hard for me to become too distant from that. And then finally, I think I just wrote about it because it was just very, very personally satisfying and personally important for me to do. It felt like, it had given me so much, and I feel like to be able to write about it fully is to think about it and love it, even if that physical space in Michigan isn't always available to me.
Quinn, can you help us draw the connections across the three pieces thus far in the We Got It series?
Sure. So I think with the first two, what I really wanted to do is establish kind of a theoretical framework, but also a language by which we might be able to think about and articulate blackness differently. I think in my own daily life, I think I have a very different understanding or interpretation of the world and of blackness and how it exists within the world than kind of contemporary mainstream political discourse about blackness. And so I think it was important for me to kind of interpret and break down some of my fundamental starting points, with especially the first piece and then moving on to the second piece. And then I think with the third piece and hopefully with the progressions after this one, there will be kind of the ability to kind of take the tools that I've hoped to be able to establish with the first couple pieces and use it to really dig a little bit deeper into some problems that I've either seen in my own life or issues that I see in the larger systems of the world, and how we can kind of use some of the language that we have and some of the frameworks and be able to apply it to different contexts to then hopefully be able to materially build, imagine, create praxis in a different fashion than we may be used to. And so hopefully I'll be able to use the progression of the series to then, progress and deepen that language, deepen that ability to understand.
What do you hope readers in this community may think or experience at the end of reading your piece?
I think that's always challenging because I think, at least with my own work, I think so much of it is about, my own ability to mourn, think, create, So I think it's hard when I want to try and give that to someone else because it's such a deeply personal writing experience. What I will say though is I hope that we can think really critically about what we interpret blackness to be, what we interpret the world to be. I think especially in the political, especially in liberal places like Evanston, there's so much baggage that comes with when we talk about blackness. There's the assumption that if you're talking about blackness, you're either Malcolm or Martin, or you're, a Democrat, or you're, have all this type of intellectual baggage that is carried with you. And I hope that, a lot of this baggage, or what's selected to be put on top of Black thought in the contemporary is, often curated by whiteness, the academy, the archives that are all, administered by white folks. So I think hopefully with the series, and at the end of the pieces, we can start kind of wiping this table clean, wiping the slate clean to try and, to build on top of it. I think that's what good writing, good philosophy, good theorizing is it's critically looking at what we know, why we know it, and how we can kind of build from there.
Thank you. And our final question is, you write about building a world out of the terror and the beauty of anti-Black violence. What does it mean for you to think about the terror and beauty together?
I think this is a question that's really been influenced deeply by Fred Moten and Saidiya Hartman when they talk about terror, when they talk about beauty. I think, we are in my English class right now reading the narrative of Frederick Douglass, and so much of it interprets Black life, Blackness as saturated with suffering. I remember a student in one of my classes saying that, like, the reason why the question was, why does Frederick Douglass not include any scenes of joy or freedom that were experienced on the plantation? And the answer to that question was because there was no joy in Black life. And I think that's a really scary and a really terrifying way for me to think about Blackness. And I think it's really sad if, all the images that we have in the political are about violence, terror, and I think there's a lot of violence that then becomes apparent when we only see Blackness as depicted as suffering. But I think also, on the other hand of that, there is a certain degree of violence when we only see Black celebration, when we only see Black joy, and we can't understand how these moments of joy are always invaded by terror and the very present fact that fleshiness, bodiliness can be taken away at a moment's notice. So hopefully we can see the ways in which joy and beauty and life and freedom and magic invade the moments of pain and horror and violence. And then reciprocally, we can see the ways in which pain and horror and violence invade the moments of fugitivity, freedom, joy, life, and celebration. So hopefully for me, by thinking through my grandparents' house, by thinking through Stevie Wonder, by thinking through Alice Walker, and by other Black folks that have kind of helped me think about the world and helped me think about myself differently, we can build a picture, we can build a language, and we can build love and community out of that. I think for me that's all it's about. It's about language and it's about community, because if we can be able to talk about ourselves, we can be able to love ourselves, that's the first step to being able to build, grow, connect with others. That's all. That's what it's all about.
Thank you, Quinn, for your time today. Thank you.